I Am Malala, Chapter 3, Growing Up in a School. My mother started school when she was 6 and stopped the same term. She was unusual in the village as she had a father and brothers who encouraged her to go to school. She was the only girl in a class of boys. She carried her bag of books proudly into school and claimed she was brighter than the boys. But every day she would leave behind her girl cousins playing at home and she envied them. There seemed no point in going to school to just end up cooking, cleaning, and bringing up children, so one day she sold her books for 9 annas, spent the money on boiled sweet, and never went back. Her father said nothing. She says he didn't even notice as he would set off early every morning after a breakfast of cornbread and cream, his German pistol strapped under his arm, and spent his days busy with local politics or resolving feuds. Besides, he had 7 other children to think about. It was only when she met my father and she felt regret. Here was a man who had read so many books, who wrote her poems she could not read, and whose ambition was to have his own school. As his wife, she wanted to help him achieve that. For as long as my father could remember, it had been his dream to open a school, but with no family contacts or money, it was extremely hard for him to realize his dream. He thought there was nothing more important than knowledge. He remembered how mystified he had been by the river in his village, wondering where the water came from and went to, until he learned about the water cycle from the rain to sea. His own village school had been just a small building. Many of his classes were taught under a tree on the bare ground. There were no toilets, and the pupils went to fields to answer the call of nature. Yet he says he was actually lucky. His sister, my aunts, did not go to school at all, like just millions of girls in my country. Education had been a great gift for them. He believed that lack of education was the root of all Pakistan's problems. Ignorance allowed politicians to fool people and bad administrators to be re-elected. He believed schooling should be available for all, rich, poor, boys and girls. The school that my father dreamed of would have desks and library, computers, bright posters on the walls, and most important, washrooms. My grandfather had a different dream for his youngest son. He longed for him to be a doctor, and as one of just 2 sons, he expected him to contribute to the household budget. My father's elder brother, Saeed Ramzan, had worked for years as a teacher at a local school. He and his family lived with my grandfather, and whenever he saved up enough of his salary, they built a small concrete hijra at the side of the house for the guests. He brought logs back from the mountains for firewood, and after teaching, he would work in the fields where our family had a few buffaloes. He also helped Baba with heavy tasks like clearing snow from the roof. When my father was offered a place for his A levels at Jahanab College, which is the best further education institution in Swat, my grandfather refused to pay for his living expenses. His own education in Delhi had been free. He had lived like a talib in the mosque, and local people had provided the students with food and clothes. Tuition at Janab was free, but my father needed money to live on. Pakistan doesn't have student loans, and he had never set foot in a bank. The college was in Saidu Sharif, the twin town of Mingora, and he had no family there with whom he could stay. There was no other college in Shangla, and he didn't go to college, he would never be able to move out of the village and realize his dream. My father was at his wits' ends and wept with his frustration. His beloved mother had died just before he graduated from school. He knew if she had been alive, she would have been on his side. He pleaded with his father, but to no avail. His only hope was his brother-in-law in Karachi. My grandfather suggested that he might take my father in so he could go to college there. The couple would soon be arriving in the village as they were coming to offer condolences after my grandmother's death. My father prayed they would agree, but my grandfather asked them as soon as they arrived, exhausted after the 3-day bus journey, and his son-in-law refused outright. My grandfather was so furious he would not speak to them for the entire stay. My father left, he had lost his chance and would end up like his brother teaching in a local school. The school where Uncle Khan Dada taught was in the mountain village of Savur, about an hour and a half's climb from their house. It didn't even have its own building. They used the big hall in the mosque where they taught more than 100 children ranging from 5 to 15 years old. The people in Sabur were Gurjars, Koshitanis, and Mians. We regard Mians as noble or landed people, but Gurjars and Koshitanis are what we call hilly people, peasants who look after buffaloes. Their children were usually dirty and they were looked upon by Pashtuns even if they are poor themselves. They are dirty, black, and stupid, people would say. Let them be illiterate. It is often said that teachers don't like to be posted to such remote schools and generally make a deal with their colleagues so that only one of them has to go work each day. If the school has two teachers, each goes in for 3 days and signs the other in. If it has three teachers, each go in for just 2 days. Once there, all they do is to keep children quiet with a long stick, as they cannot imagine education will be of any use to them. My uncle was more dutiful. He liked the hilly people and respected their tough lives. So he went to the school most days and actually tried to teach the children. After my grandfather had graduated from school, he had nothing to do, so he volunteered to help his brother. There his luck changed. Another of my aunts had married a man in that village, and they had a relative visiting called Nasir Pacha who saw my father at work. Nasir Pacha had spent years in Saudi Arabia working in construction, making money to send back to his family. My father told him he had just finished school and had won a college place at Jehanazeb. He did not mention he could not afford to take it as he did not want to embarrass his father. Why don't you come and live with us? Asked Nasir Pasha. Oof, I was so happy by God, says my father. Pasha, his wife, Paktamina Jajai, and their two sons became his second family. Their home was in Spalbandi, a beautiful mountain village on the way to the White Palace, and my father describes it as a romantic and inspirational place. My father went there by bus, and it seemed so big to him compared to his home village that he thought he had arrived in a city. As a guest, he was treated exceptionally well. Jajai replaced his late mother as the most important woman in my father's life. When a villager complained to her that he was flirting with a girl living across the road, she defended him. Ziauddin is as clean as an egg with no hair, she said. Look instead to your own daughter. It was in Spal Bandi that my father came across women who had great freedom and were not hidden away as in his own village. The women of Spal Bandi had a beautiful spot on top of the mountain where they could congregate to chat about their everyday lives. It was unusual for women to have a special place to meet outside the home. It was also there that my father met his mentor Akbar Khan, who, although he had not gone to college himself, lent my father money so he could. Like my mother, Akbar Khan may not have had much of formal education, but he had another kind of wisdom. My father often spoke of the kindness of the Akbar Khan and Nasir Pasha to illustrate that if you help someone in need, you might also receive unexpected aid. My father arrived at college at an important moment in Pakistan's history. That summer, while he was walking in the mountains, our dictator, General Zia, was killed in a mysterious plane crash, which many people said was caused by a bomb hidden in a crate of mangoes. During my father's first term at college, national elections were held, which were won by Benazir Bhutto, daughter of the prime minister who had been executed when my father was a boy. Benazir was our first female prime minister and the first in Islamic world. Suddenly, there was a lot of optimism about the future. Student organizations, which had been banned under Zia, became very active. My father quickly got involved in student politics and became known as talented speaker and a debater. He was made General Secretary of Pakhtun Students Federation (PSF), which wanted equal rights for Pashtuns. The most important job in the army, bureaucracy, and the government are all taken by Punjabis because they came from biggest and the most powerful province. The other main students' organization was Islami Jamaat-e-Talaba, the student wing of the religious party Jamaat-e-Islami, which was powerful in many universities in Pakistan. They provided free textbooks and grants to students but held deeply intolerant views, and their favorite pastime was to patrol universities and sabotage music concerts. The party had been so close to General Zia and done badly in the elections. The president of the students group in Jehanabaz College was Ishan ul Haq Haqqani. Though he and my father were great rivals, they admired each other and later became friends. Haqqani says he is sure my father would have been president of the PSF and become a politician if he had been from a rich Khan family. Student politics was all about debating and charisma, but party politics required money. One of their most heated debates in the first year was over a novel. The book was called The Satanic Verses by Salman Rushdie, and it was a parody of Life of the Prophet, PBUH, set in Bombay. Muslims widely considered it blasphemous and provoked so much outrage that it seemed people were talking of little else. The odd thing was no one had even noticed the publication of the book to start with. It wasn't actually on sale in Pakistan, but then a series of articles appeared in Urdu newspaper by a mullah close to our intelligence service, rating the book as offensive to the Prophet PBUH and saying it was a duty of good Muslims to protest. Soon mullahs all over the Pakistan were denouncing the book, calling for it to be banned, and angry demonstrations were held. The most violent took place in Islamabad on 12 February 1989 when American flags were set alight in the front of American Center. Even though Rushdie and his publishers were British, police fired into the crowd and 5 people were killed. The anger wasn't just in Pakistan. 2 days after, Ayatollah Khomeini, the supreme leader of Iran, issued a fatwa calling of Rushdie's assassination. My father's college held a heated debate in packed room. Many students argued that the book should be banned and burned and the fatwa upheld. My father also saw the book as offensive to Islam but suggested, first, let's read the book and then why not respond with our own book? He ended by asking in a thundering voice my grandfather would have been proud of, is Islam such a weak religion that it cannot tolerate a book written against it? Not my Islam. For the first few years after graduating from Jehanabad Zaib, my father worked as an English teacher in a well-known private college, but the salary was low, just 1,600 rupees a month, around $19. And my grandfather complained he was not contributing to the household. It was also not enough for him to save for the wedding he hoped for to his beloved Turpekai. One of my father's colleagues at the school was his dear friend Muhammad Naeem Khan, who once generally smashed his clay money box full of savings to help my father financially. He and my father had studied for their bachelor's and master's degree in English together and were both passionate about education. They were also both frustrated as the school was very strict and unimaginative. My father longed for the freedom that would come with running of his own school. He wanted to encourage independent thought and hated the way the school he was in rewarded obedience above open-mindedness and creativity. So when Naeem lost his job after a dispute with the college administration, they decided to start their own school. The original plan was to open a school in my father's village of Sahapur, where there was a desperate need, like a shop in a community where there are no shops, he said. But when they went there to look for a building, there were banners everywhere advertising a school opening. Someone had beaten them to it. So they decided to set up an English language school in Mingora. As the government schools were failing, private English medium schools offered better education. As my father was still teaching, Naeem wandered the streets looking for somewhere to rent. One day he called my father excitedly to say he had found the ideal place. It was the ground floor of a 2-story building in a well-off area called Landikas, with a walled courtyard where students could gather. The previous tenants had also run a school, the Ramada School. The owner had called it that because he had once been to Turkey and seen a Ramada hotel, but the school had gone bankrupt, which perhaps should have made them think twice. Also, the building was on the banks of a river where people threw their rubbish and it smelled foul in hot weather. My father went to see the building after work. It was a perfect night with stars and full moon just above the trees, which he took to be a sign. I felt so happy, he recalls. My dream was coming true. Naeem and my father invested entire saving of 60,000 rupees. They borrowed 30,000 rupees more to repaint the building, rented a shack across the road to live in, and went from door to door trying to find students. Unfortunately, the demand for English tuition turned out to be low, and there was unexpected drain on their income. My father's involvement in political discussions continued after college. Every day, his fellow activists came to the shack or school or the school for lunch. We can't afford all this entertaining, Naeem would complain. It was also becoming clear that while they were best friends, they found it hard to work as business partners. On top of that, there was a stream of guests from Shangla now that my father had a place for them to stay. We Pashtuns cannot turn away relatives or friends, however inconvenient. We don't inspect privacy, and there is no such thing as making an appointment to see someone. Visitors can turn up whenever they wish and can stay as long as they want. It was a nightmare for someone trying to start a business, and it drove Naeem to distraction. He joked to my father that if either of them had relatives to stay, they should pay a fine. My father kept trying to persuade Naeem's friends and family to stay so he could not be fined too. After 3 months, Naeem had enough. We, we are supposed to be collecting money in enrollment fees. Instead, the only money knocking on our doors are beggars. There is a Herculean task, he added. I can't take any more. But this time, the two former friends were hardly speaking to each other and had to call in local elders to mediate. My father was desperate not to give up the school to agree to pay Naeem a return on his share of the investment. He had no idea. Fortunately, another old college friend called Hidayatullah stepped in and agreed to put up the money and take Naeem's place. The new partners again went from door to door, telling people they had started a new kind of a school. My father is so charismatic that Hidayatullah say he is a kind of a person who, if invited to your house, will make friends with your friends. But while people were happy to talk to him, they preferred to send their children to established schools. They named it at Kushal School after one of my father's great heroes. Kushal Khan's Katak, a warrior poet from Akora just south of Swat, who tried to unify all Pashtun tribes against the Mughals in the 17th century. Near the entrance, they painted a motto composed by Naeem Khan, "We are committed to build for you the call of the new era." My father also designed a shield with the famous quote from Katak in Pashto, "I gird my sweat in the name of Afghan honor." My father wanted us to be inspired by our great hero, but in manner fit for our times, with pens, no swords. Just as Katak had wanted the Pashtuns to unite against a foreign enemy, so we needed to unite against ignorance. Unfortunately, not many people were convinced. When the school opened, they had just 3 students. Even so, my father insisted on starting the day in style by singing the national anthem. Then his nephew Aziz, who had come to help raise the Pakistan flag. With so few students, they had little money to keep the school and soon ran out of credit. Neither man could get any money from their families, and Hidayatullah was not pleased to discover that my father was still in debt. Lots of people from college, so they were always receiving letters demanding money. There was worse in store when my father went to register the school. After being made to wait for hours, he was finally ushered into the office of the official of school, who sat behind towering piles of files surrounded by hangers on drinking trees. What kind of school is this?" asked the official, laughing at his application. "How many teachers do you have?" 3. "Your teachers are not trained. Everyone thinks they can open a school just like that." The other people in the office laughed along, ridiculing him. My father was angry. It was clear the officials wanted money. Pashtuns cannot stand anyone belittling them, nor was he about to pay a bribe for something he was entitled to. He and Hidayatullah hardly had money to pay for food, let alone bribes. The going rate of registration was about 13,000 rupees, more if they thought you were rich, and school were expected to treat officials regularly to a good lunch of chicken or trout from the river. The education officer would call to arrange an inspection, then give a detailed order for his lunch. My father used to grumble, "We're a school, not a poultry farm." So when the official angled for a bribe, my father turned on him with all force of his year of debating. "Why are you asking all these questions?" He demanded. Am I in an office or I am in a police station or a court? Am I a criminal? He decided to challenge the officials to protect our other schools' owners from such bullying and corruption. He knew that to do this he needed some power of his own. So he joined an organization called the SOT or Association of Private Schools. It was small in those days, just 15 members, and my father quickly became vice president. The other principals took paying bribes for granted, but my father argued that if all schools joined together, they could resist. Running a school is not a crime, he told them. Why should you be paying bribes? You are not running brothels or you are educating children. Government officials are not your bosses. He reminded them, they are your servants. They are taking salaries and have to serve you. You are the ones educating their children. He soon became president of organization and expanded it until it included 400 principals. Suddenly the school owners were in a position of power. But my father has always been a romantic rather than a businessman, and in the meantime he and Hidayatullah were in such desperate straits that they ran out of credit with the local shopkeeper and could not even buy tea or sugar. To try and boost their income, they ran a sweet shop at school, going off in the mornings and buying snacks to sell to the children. My father even once brought maize and stayed up late at night making the bagging popcorn. I would get every depressed I would get very depressed and sometimes collapse seeing the problems all around us, said Hidayatullah. But when Ziauddin is in crisis, he becomes strong and his spirits high. My father insisted that they need to think big. One day, Hidayatullah came back from trying to enroll pupils to find my father sitting in the office talking about advertising with the local head of Pakistan TV. As soon as the man had gone, Hidayatullah burst into laughter. Ziauddin, we don't even have a TV, he pointed out. If we advertise, we won't be able to watch it. But my father is an optimistic man and never deterred by practicalities. One day my father told Hidayatullah he was going back to his village for a few days. He was actually getting married, but he didn't tell any of friends in Mingora as he could not afford to entertain them. Our wedding go on for several days of feasting. In fact, as my mother often reminds my father, he was not present for the actual ceremony. He was only there for the last day, when family members held a Quran and a shawl over their heads and held a mirror for them to look into. For many couples in arranged marriage, that is the first day to see each other's faces. A small boy was brought to sit up on their laps to encourage the birth of a son. It is our tradition for the bride to receive furniture or perhaps a fridge from her family and some gold from the groom's family. My grandfather would not buy enough gold, so my father had to borrow more money to buy bangles. After the wedding, my mother moved in with my grandfather and my uncle. My father returned to the village every 2 or 3 weeks to see her. The plan was to get his school going, then once it was successful, send for his wife. But Baba kept complaining about the drain of his income and made my mother's life miserable. She had a little money of her own, so they used it to hire a van and she moved to Mingora. They had no idea how they would manage. We just knew my father didn't want us there, said my father. At that time I was unhappy with my family, but later I was grateful as it made me more independent. He had, however, neglected to tell his partner. Hidayatullah was horrified when my father returned to Mingora with his wife. We are not in a position to support a family, he told my father. Where will she live? It's okay, replied my father. She will cook and wash for us. My mother was excited to be in Mingora. To her, it was a modern town. When she and her friends had discussed their dreams as young girls by the river, most had just said they wanted to marry and have children and cook for their husbands. When it was mother's turn, she said, I want to live in the city and be able to send out for kebabs and naan instead of cooking it myself. However, life wasn't quite what she expected. The shack had just 2 rooms, one where Hidayatullah and my father slept, and one which was a small office. There was no kitchen, no plumbing. When my mother arrived, Hidayatullah had to move into the office and sleep on a hard wooden chair. My father consulted my mother on everything. Pikai, help me resolve my confusion on this. He would say. She even helped whitewash the school walls, holding up the lanterns so they could paint when the light went off in power cuts. Ziauddin was a family man and they were unusually close, said Hidayatullah. While most of us can't live with our wives, he couldn't be without his. Within a few months, my mother was expecting. Their first child, born in 1995, was a girl and stillborn. I think there were some problems with hygiene in that muddy place, says my father. I assume women could give birth without going to hospital as my mother and my sisters had in the village. My mother gave birth to 10 children in this way. The school continued to lose money. Months would pass and they could not pay the teachers' wages or the school rent. The goldsmith kept coming and demanding his money for my mother's wedding bangles. My father would make him good tea and offer him biscuits in the hope that would keep him satisfied. Hidayatullah laughed. You think he will be happy with tea? He wants his money. The situation becomes so dire that my father was forced to sell the gold bangles. In our culture, wedding jewelry is a bond between the couple. Often women sell their jewelry to help set up their husbands in business or to pay their fares to go abroad. My mother had already offered her bangles to pay for my father's nephew to go to college, which my father had rashly promised to fund. Fortunately, my father's cousin Zihan Sheikh had stepped in, and she did not realize the bangles were only partly paid for. She was then furious when she learned that my father did not get a good price for them. Just when it seemed matters could not get worse, the area was hit by flash flood. There was a day when it did not stop raining, and in the late afternoon there was warning of flooding. Everyone had to leave the district. My mother was away, and Hidayatullah needed my father to help him move everything up to the first floor, safe from the fast rising waters, but he couldn't find him anywhere. He went outside shouting, Ziauddin, Ziauddin. The search almost cost Hidayatullah his life. The narrow street outside the school was totally flooded, and he was soon up to his neck in water. There were live electric cables hanging loose and swaying in the wind. He watched paralyzed with fear as they almost touched the water. Had they done so, he would have been electrocuted. When he finally found my father, he learned that he had heard a woman crying that her husband was trapped in their house and he had rushed in to save him. Then he helped them save their fridge. Hidayatullah was furious. You saved this woman's husband but not your own house? He said. Was it because of the cry of a woman? When the waters receded, they found their home and school destroyed. Their furniture, carpet, books, clothes, and the audio system entirely caked in thick, foul-smelling mud. They had nowhere to sleep and no clean clothes to change into. Luckily, a neighbor called Mr. Amanuddin took them in for the night. It took them a week to clear the debris. They were both away when 10 days later there was a second flood and the building again filled with mud. Shortly afterward, they had visit from an official of WAPDA, the water and the power company, who claimed their meter was rigged and demanded a bribe. When my father refused, a bill arrived with a large fine. There was no way they could pay this, so my father asked one of his political friends to use his influence. It started to feel as though the school was not meant to be, but my father would not give up on his dream so easily. Besides, he had a family to provide for. I was born until 12 July 1997. My mother was helped by a neighbor who had delivered babies before. My father was in school waiting, and when he heard the news, he came running. My mother was worried about telling him he had a daughter, not a son. But he says he looked into my eyes and was delighted. Malala was a lucky girl, said Hidayatullah. When she was born, our luck changed. But not immediately. On Pakistan's 50th anniversary, on 14th August 1997, there were parades and commemorations throughout the country. However, my father's friend Ishanullah Khakani organized a sit-in protest to show that there was nothing to celebrate, as Swat had only suffered since it had merged with Pakistan. They wore black armbands to protest, saying the celebration were for nothing, and were arrested. They had to pay a fine they could not afford. A few months after I was born, the 3 rooms above the school became vacant and we all moved in. The walls were concrete and there was running water, so it was an improvement on our shabby house, but we were still very cramped, as we were sharing it with Hidayatullah and we almost always had guests. The first school was a mixed primary school and very small. By the time I was born, it had 5 or 6 teachers and around 100 pupils paying 100 rupees a month. My father was teacher, accountant, and principal. He also swept the floors, whitewashed the walls, and cleaned the bathrooms. He used to climb up electricity poles to hang banners advertising the school, even though he was so afraid of heights that when he go to the top of the ladder, his feet shook. If the water pump stopped working, he would go down the well to repair it himself. When I saw him disappear down there, I would cry, thinking of he wouldn't come back. After paying the rent and salaries, there was little money left for food. We drank green tea as we could not afford milk for regular tea. But after a while, the school started to break even, and my father began to plan a second school which he wants to call the Malala Education Academy. I had the run of the school as my playground. My father tells me even before I could talk, I would toddle into classes and talk as if I were a teacher. Some of the female staff, like Miss Olforth, would pick me up and put me on their laps as if I were their pet, or even take me home with them for a while. When I was 3 or 4, I was placed in classes for much older children. I used to sit and wonder, listening to everything they were being taught. Sometimes I would mimic the teachers. You could say I grew up in a school. As my father had found with Naeem, it is not easy to mix business and friendship. Eventually, Hidayatullah left to start his own school, and they divided the students, each taking 2 of the 4 years. They did not tell people, as they wanted people to think the school was expanding and had 2 buildings. Though Hidayatullah and my father weren't speaking at that time, Hidayatullah missed me so much he used to visit me. It was while he was visiting one afternoon in September 2001 that there was a great commotion and other people started arriving. They said there had been a big attack on a building in New York. 2 planes had flown into it. I was only 4 and too young to understand. Even for adults, it was hard to imagine. The biggest building in SWAT are the hospitals and a hotel, which are 2 or 3 stories. It seemed very far away. I had no idea what New York and America were. The school was my world, and my world was the school. We did not realize then that 9/11 would change our world too, and would bring war into our valley.